Hello and welcome to the Katie and Siegfried Show. Today we're going to talk about our two trips to Blenheim House. The first time just because we had heard about it, and the second time for Fairfax History Day. So this will probably be a blend of both because, some of the memories kind of mushed together. But let's start with the first time we went there.
And to clarify, this is the Blenheim House in Fairfax, not the Blenheim House in England. So Blenheim House, we went for the first time on April 2nd, which is a Saturday, and we took a tour of the house and gardens, and when we were in the house, it was really cool because we saw a lot of Civil War soldiers who wrote their signatures on the walls, and we also saw the family cemetery, and we were able to look at the outside of Grandma's cottage, but we were able to go in that when we went in a few weeks later for Fairfax History Day. In the visitor center, they were able to see a recreation of the attic names on the walls because it's apparently not safe to go in the attic right now. They're renovating it, so they're like, let's recreate it in the visitor center, which is really cool. And we were super excited to go back for Fairfax History Day in a few weeks, and it was just the two of us that were there. So, 3 weeks later, on April 23rd, we went back for Fairfax History Day. So it was interesting because we saw some Civil War era dances, and they were dressed up in Civil War era outfits, and quilt making, yarn making, embroidery, people who were dressed up as Civil War soldiers, both Union and Confederate. And for the Union, they had the United States colored troops, which was interesting. There were about 200,000 black men that signed up for the Union Army. And there was a lady talking about the Underground Railroad and slave life, somebody that was dressed up as Claire Barton. She talked about, meds and medications and how our hospital just kind of built up around it. It wasn't something she intended to do, but she just kind of happened. And we went back to Grandma's cottage, and we saw how, the taverns would have been run at the time, and as well as unions talking about or Union people talking about arresting traitors. We ate lunch that was provided by the St. Leo's Knights of Columbus. We ate hot dogs and barbecue chicken. There was an African-American musician that was there. Oh, and last but not least, we saw brickmakers from Colonial Williamsburg. It was actually one of my former coworkers. His wife, his name is Kenneth, and we saw his wife too. So that was fun.
Yeah. All right. So that's a quick rundown of all the events, but let's take it now step by step.
Okay.
So the first time we went there, we had basically no expectations because we just kind of heard of this place and weren't sure how much there was to do there because it's literally called Blenheim House, implying that it's just one building, right, or something small. So we thought we'd be there, maybe half an hour, and I think that trip turned into a 2-hour long trip or something?
Yeah, it was about 2 hours.
Okay, so we get there, and we're like I said, we're thinking, okay, this is going to be maybe 30 minutes or so.
It's not the biggest house in the world.
Not the largest house in the world, and, we walked over from St. Leo's, and it didn't look like it would be very long, but we thought, hey, it'll be fun, it's a historic part of Fairfax, and we discovered a lot of things. First of all, that it's part of the history trail, Civil War history trail in Virginia, and they have a lot of sites across Fairfax County and other neighboring regions that are part of this, and they recommend you go to visit them. So we got a lot of good information in their visitor center about that, as well as Katie mentioned, there's a section in the visitor center that is specifically recreations of Civil War era soldiers, specifically Union soldiers, names and regiments and whatever they wrote on the walls of the house itself over the years. They've replicated portions of the attic because that's the best kept portion, but unfortunately you can't go there currently, like she mentioned. But yeah, we got to see that in the visitor center, the recreation. That was really cool. It's quite interesting to see the varying levels of legibility, and also some people have very nice John Hancocks, others have doctor-esque writing, where
that's what I
it's
meant
like,
by legibility.
okay, well, I mean, some of them like are easier to read too.
That's what legible means.
No, I mean like literally in terms of like how well kept it is.
Oh, how well preserved.
Right,
Okay.
because over the years, some of this writing hasn't stayed as well, and others have. So there's a mixture of both problems, right? Some of it's hard to read because it's written in like doctor script, and then there's others that are hard to read just because it hasn't stayed as well.
Yeah.
So it's a mixture of problems, but it's very interesting because some people would write like very detailed information, like 1862 to 1863. I'm in the 44th, Virginian regiment or whatever. Not Virginian because they're Union soldiers, but you know what I mean. Like some of them would be very detailed. Others would just be like John S. And it's like, okay, well who's John S? Like there's 100 John S. Like probably a couple thousand John S's. Like So that was very interesting to see the difference. And they mentioned that they try to go beyond just like, okay, this was John Smith of New York was this guy, but we want to learn more. Like, okay, what did he do after the war if he survived, or did he die?
Yeah.
So the visitor center was like one of the better visitor centers I've been to.
Yeah. There was one guy, I forget what his name was, but he just wrote it as like first initial and like last name and then the year, and they were like, we don't even know who this guy is because there's several different guys that it could have been.
Right.
And we're like, we're like, well, let's just tell you about some of them. Like,
yeah, and that's one of the problems is that a lot of these gentlemen have like very similar names.
Yeah.
So unless they literally wrote like, hey, like I'm Peter Smith from, I don't know, New York City, New York.
Yeah.
And I was here in 1862 to 1863 or whatever the time frame is with this group, it's very hard to identify them. Some of them did have unique names and they were able to identify them very nicely.
Yeah,
and some of them did write, like I said, their regiment exactly. So it's like, we know this John Smith is from the 42nd so-and-so group. We can track him.
Yeah, but if they just wrote P. Smith, 42nd New York, like, could be Peter Smith, could be Paul Smith, could be some other Smith. So
yeah, and that was very interesting too, because like I said, they're doing their absolute best to like get this sorted, in terms of like not only can we identify the soldier who wrote this, but hey, let's find out what he did after the war. Like, okay, this guy went on and became a journalist after the war, or maybe this guy got education after the war and became a doctor, or maybe this guy, unfortunately, after the war was struck with poverty for the rest of his life and died,
or
in the streets of New York, or who knows, or he became a senator or something,
Or this guy died in Gettysburg,
or had dysentery, because that was the other interesting thing. Yeah, dysentery, sorry.
Okay. I was like, what's dysentery?
That was the other interesting thing, because they did mention that the house wasn't just for housing troops, but it basically became a field hospital at times because, diseases spread very quickly in those conditions, and especially back then because it's very unsanitary. So it went from like a home to house troops to a field hospital, and the family would occasionally send someone back to check in on the house, but there was at the time that the Union soldiers took over, there was nothing they could do because the family strongly identified as Virginians and sided with the Confederacy, and so the house was basically just Union Army property at that point, and they had no say in what happened, which was interesting. But yeah, so there was an area, I think they had like a video or something that they would play every certain amount of time.
I don't remember.
They had like a room for like video playing, but we didn't go to it because I forget exactly the time frame, but we didn't think we'd be there that long, so we opted to go to the tour, which by the way was free. Not there was no charge for any of this.
There's a charge for Fairfax History Day, but not for like...
Right, but if you go there like normally, it's just free. You can get a free tour. They're entirely donation funded outside of Fairfax History Day, which is an annual event. But yeah, so we went to the house, and it was a really nice tour. They took us around all the first floor. You cannot go upstairs because of safety reasons, so you can't go in the attic and see the best preserved spots, but they actually have quite a few nice items of like soldiers' writings that are pretty well preserved even on that floor. It was interesting to see, like I said, the different size that people wrote in, the different quality of their writing, and the different preservation status, because some of them, like, you can barely see that someone wrote something. You can tell someone wrote something, but like it's very hard. And others, it feels like almost like this was written yesterday.
Yeah.
It's preserved so nicely, and they also had recreations of different items, like different clothing items. They said, unfortunately, like for most of this, we don't have original pieces because, well, the soldiers trashed the place, and also certain items just don't generally survive over 100+ years, 150-ish years.
60.
So yeah, it's like a lot of this was recreations, but like either this is as close as we can get, or we have written information about what it looked like.
Yeah.
So it's not 1-to-1, but it's pretty close, and it was very cool to look at.
Yeah, and one interesting one, I don't know if you remember this one, Siegfried, but it was by the front door, and he was like, I forget what his name was, but he was like, oh, I feel so bad about doing this. My mom would not like me if, would not like it if she knew I did this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And there was this other one that his signature was split between 2 rooms because the wall got put up after he signed the wall. There was a wall splitting the room into 2 rooms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, that was interesting. He did write a very long message about, hey, like, I shouldn't do this, but like everyone else is doing it. My mom wouldn't like that I'm doing this, so like I'm sorry that I'm just like defacing such a beautiful house, but like everyone else is doing it, I'm gonna do it, which is interesting that he'd apologize while doing it anyways. But I suppose it's one of those things where like a lot of people mentally when you're young or in a peer pressure situation, a lot of the times you'll find a way to be like, okay, like I'm gonna do this, but like I'm gonna apologize or feel bad about it, like in a way make yourself feel better about doing something wrong. But yeah, that was very interesting. That was one of the better preserved ones. And then we walked the grounds. We couldn't go into the cottage that day because it wasn't ready to be opened, but they said it would be ready to be opened by Fairfax History Day, which is when we did go in there. We also went by the graveyard, and they talked about that a little bit. They gave a very good talk. And then they mentioned Fairfax History Day, which we had already heard about because when I looked up Blenheim House on the Fairfax government site, it mentioned it.
Yeah, you found Blenheim House through Googling, right?
Yeah, so a couple, gosh, it might have been 2020, it might have been 2021, I can't remember. But I had Googled a while back historic sites in Fairfax or near Fairfax, and I think Blenheim came up.
Yes.
And I was like, oh, Katie and I should go. It'll be a lot of fun. And then for whatever reason, we just didn't. It didn't pan out. And I was thinking about it this year because I'm like, man, I remember like looking up and there was something interesting I wanted to go see. So I looked up again, and that's when I found out about Fairfax History Day and that it was free to go there. So I was like, all right, let's go there, and then like we can talk about Fairfax History Day. Don't know if we'll be able to make it scheduling wise, and maybe it won't be worthwhile cost wise. Like I don't know how much this place has, so like. But yeah, so we went, and we really loved the place, and it was great, and we were very excited to come back and see the cottage. So that was pretty much what happened the first time. So the second time we come back, we went to St. Leo's again, and it seemed to be someone was getting prepared to get married, I think, which was sweet. But we walked over back to Blenheim House. They actually have a place on Fairfax History Day. I think it's at Fairfax High School.
Yeah.
Where you park there and they'll have buses shuttle you over, or you can walk over from there. But we went from St. Leo's because it was on a Saturday.
Yes.
So the school's closed at the time, and they're not going to bother you parking there because you go into church. And we went into the church on our way back, so that was very nice. But anyways. We go up there, and the police are out there helping direct traffic and getting people across safely. Very nicely done, very very well done. And we went over, and we paid to get in. It wasn't too expensive. The food was reasonably priced as well, for the record. And the first thing we got to see was a Civil War group, dance group.
Yes.
And that was very cool. They did multiple different kinds of dances, kind of showing how dancing would have been done back then, and it's very interesting to me because of how communal it was, right? Like you're not just dancing with your wife or fiance or girlfriend or what have you. You're dancing with all the other people there. Not, like gentlemen are swapping their partners with other people there. So like it's very communal, right? You're dancing with multiple different people. Um, it's very interesting how communal it was, and they did get specific outfits and everything done specifically for their design. So that was very cool. We watched that for a while, and then we walked off, and I believe that's when we went to the brick making section,
Yes.
and that was very cool. It was very interesting to get chat with them for a little bit. They also had next to them a carpenter, if I remember right.
Yes.
Which was cool. He was cutting up some wood, getting it the old way, which was interesting to watch because you don't see that today. And then we went over to see the quilt makers and a couple of other groups over there.
Yeah, there was the embroidery people. There was yarn making. Yeah, yarn making. Another place we found out from the quilt maker and people that there's a quilt museum in Harrisonburg. So
yeah, that was very interesting, and the designs that they had are absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to hear how like those are made and how much effort goes in. It's like multiple different people make this, right? Because these things are huge, and it would just take. It already takes a large amount of time with like, let's say 4 people. So like one person alone, probably impossible. But the interesting thing to note was that the lady was telling us that like you see it has this person's name, right? Like Mrs. Harrison or something, and she's like, well, Mrs. Harrison might have made part of it, but in reality, it was probably the slaves that did the majority of the work, and it was just branded as Mrs. Harrison because she owns the property, and at the time, technically slaves were property, so they weren't allowed to put their name on things, right? Like they wouldn't be branding things like that.
And then also sometimes there'd be like groups of like white women getting together and making them. And then whoever would be like quote unquote in charge, that would be the name that was on there.
Right. So that was interesting to hear that like this was also almost a communal effort in the sense that it took a lot of people to make these kinds of things. And so yeah, we walked from there over in this little tent to another section, and we got to see I think it was yarn making, or was it wool making?
It was yarn from wool.
It was yarn from wool. That's why my brain's getting mixed up. Yeah, that was really cool because you have to keep in mind, this is not like modern day wool making or yarn making, excuse me. This is like old time yarn making. Like she's like pulling junk out of the yarn, the wool, and then putting it through a what's the machine called?
A spinning wheel.
Yeah, it's very slow process, very arduous, but like the end result is absolutely beautiful. And that was very cool. And then we saw, like he said, we saw embroidering and some other stuff. I can't remember if they had. I think they also had in that area the old time puzzles that the kids would play with.
I believe so, yeah.
Which was kind of cool to look at. And then we walked over past the soldiers' tents because they, like Katie said, they had Union and Confederate soldiers. And they were doing some kind of demonstration later that day. I don't think we actually saw a demonstration because we were wandering around looking at other things. But it was kind of cool because you got to see what their tents would look like and the setup of how it would have looked like if they were camping overnight, which they did a lot. And then we went over and we got to listen to a talk about slave life and how slaves would try to. The Underground Railroad and how they try to escape and what that was like for them, kind of stuff they'd bring with them, and talking about them making quilts as well, or blankets and whatnot, right? Because, you can't bring terribly much with you, so along the way, or at the end of the journey, these mostly the women were making blankets for them to stay warm so they wouldn't freeze to death. Which is something you don't generally think about, right? And it was interesting because the person giving the talk was, she was trying to get in the mindset of a very young slave, and portray her life through like acting out in a sense at demonstrations and whatnot, like like talking about like, okay, this person specifically who I think was like 13 or something, maybe even younger.
Yeah, I think he was a teenager.
Might have been even younger, but yeah, she tries to get into her life and like act that out in reality and talk about what that kid's life was like going through all this.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. They did have house tours that day as well. I can't remember if they cost more. I think they did. We didn't do it because we had already done house tour previously.
Yeah, like 3 weeks before.
So we were like, it hasn't been that long. Like, it's not like we're gonna gain like new. I mean, we might gain new knowledge, but like honestly, probably not. And there's so much stuff to do anyways. So after that, we wandered around for a little bit, and we found Clara Barton's tent, which was very interesting. Because, like Katie said, she never planned to be a full-scale like doctor operation. It was just supposed to be like, hey, I have some supplies, like I can help out the war effort, and then I'm gonna go back to my life, which of course completely changed, and life completely changed, and yeah, and it was interesting because like everything was hanging on by a thread in a sense because they didn't know what they were doing, so it's kind of like, hey, like I need certain medical supplies now, I need lamps, I need and she was talking about how at one point they were carrying everything with like open flames, and there's barrels of munitions and stuff that could have just gone up and killed everybody.
Or the time she was trying to take care of or feed 200 soldiers with 6 plates.
Yeah. So there are all kinds of problems and issues that were lessons that were learned. And then we were very excited because we got to go to Ma's cottage, and there was a talk outside there with a, I think it was like supposed to be like a Union captain or something, and a man who was imprisoned by the Union for, according to the man in prison, no reason. According to the Union captain, he was up to some suspicious activity, and there's worries about what he's going to do or say if we don't lock him up. It was an interesting debate on law and, citizen rights, and, what rights are you expected to have in times of civil war? I'm not going to get into the political discussion, but it was very interesting to hear the back and forth because, this is what they wrote about at the time, right? The guy that was in prison discussed it, and the soldiers discussed it. And then we went inside the tavern, which we hadn't been able to see the first time around, keep in mind, like I said earlier. Yeah. So that was really cool because we got to poke around in there a little bit, and the guy talked about how they used to make alcohol and serve it and leave it in the cellars because it was cooler down there, and what was it that they used to push up the booze through the tubes?
I don't remember.
It might have been soda water.
I don't remember.
I can't remember either, but yeah, apparently they came up with a solution for that because it's easier than trying to go down there and fill up barrels and or like open up a barrel, grab a bunch of booze and bring it back up and down. So they came up with a solution much like similar to what we have today, where you can just open it on tap, and that was interesting to see. And he did a really good job. I thought that guy was quite funny. Yeah. Very entertaining. I mean, to be fair to everyone that was working that day, they were all very involved, very friendly. I believe it's an all volunteer staff. Save maybe 1 or 2 people who work for the county or the city. But yeah, that was really cool. And then after that, we wandered around a little bit more and looked around at some different things. And we stopped off at a tent for colored troops. In the Union, as they were called at the time. All volunteers, of course. And we talked about how interesting it is to try to like study history because, well, you're hearing one side of the story, or maybe you're hearing multiple sides, but like realistically, a lot of these things are not written by the people that actually were there. They're written by people later, maybe even decades later. And we're trying to understand the mindset of these people, especially in those groups, because they weren't very well educated, if at all. Yeah. So they couldn't write. It's very rare that we have writings from them. There was one soldier in particular who I think wanted to be a journalist or something, and he wrote extensively about his experiences.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting to hear about, and just the amount of African Americans that joined the war effort,
Yeah.
and all that they put in was quite fascinating. I think that was one of my favorite places to stop and listen.
He
too.
said there were about 200,000 men that were like, "Hey,
Right.
we'll go fight for the Union." A lot of them were former slaves from the like South, and it started actually down in like near Williamsburg at area Fort Monroe, because a lot of the during the time the South was like, oh, our slaves are our property, and then the slaves would run away, get picked up by Union troops, and the Union's like, you consider them property? Okay, we're taking them as contraband. And then they signed up for the Union Army because they're like, hey, these people, while they're not perfect, they they're trying to fight against the people that are keeping me as a slave. So,
Wow. Yeah, and that was interesting just to talk to them about how that impacted the war, and especially in terms of the amount of soldiers. Like you said, 200,000 is a huge number. But it was interesting because he was talking about, like, how in school, when we study these things, like, think about the bias that you had, right? So, like, especially in Virginia, this is Confederate territory. And, like, a lot of our school history, when we learn about the Civil War especially, we hear almost slanted towards the Confederate side, at least in terms of, like, remembering the names of people, right? So, like, he's like, think about it. You don't have to just say it out loud, but think of the first, like, 10 names of generals that come to your mind, or even 15 or 20. And he said, I guarantee you, if you're Virginian, which we told him, we grew up locally, he's like, I guarantee you the majority of that list is going to be Confederate soldiers or generals, right? Like, those are the ones that you're going to remember more than, say, maybe someone up north, because they might talk more about the Union generals.
yeah.
And there's nothing necessarily against the school or education or anything, but, like, just an interesting note on, like, hey, like, this is the kind of bias that's introduced whenever you study history, regardless of where you're from, or like, there's always some bias in any training course, or even if you do it on your own, there's always some bias, because maybe you like reading one side more than the other, just for whatever reason. Not, doesn't even have to be a political reason. Maybe they just write nicer, or it fits your style more, or maybe you just want to learn about one side more than the other. But, like, there's always that bias. Like, yeah, just keep that in mind when you're studying these things. Like, do your best to keep that in mind and try to, like, look at the other side too, and maybe learn more about that, because it's important to hear out both sides.
Yeah.
But also keeping in mind, like, okay, what am I reading? Am I reading something that was written 40 years later? Or am I reading literally General Robert E. Lee's diary, or a letter he wrote about a battle or something? Like, there's a huge difference between, I'm literally the guy that made the decision of how the battle should go from our side, to, oh, I'm a guy that wrote about this 50 years later, and I wasn't even involved. I'm just studying, like, I read their letters and wrote what I think happened, but, like, that analysis is very different than, like, the general on the ground that was literally fighting the battle.
Yeah. And I had no idea that the United States Color Troop even existed until I got to college and I took an African American history class. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know they existed.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think I learned about it either in high school or in elementary school and middle school. I can't remember when exactly.
Maybe if I did, I don't remember it. I just remember in college being like, what?
Right, but I never knew the scale.
Yeah.
That was the thing that blew me away, is the sheer number of people that were involved. So I was like, yeah, I knew there were, like, groups of them, but, like, I didn't think it was that massive in terms of the number of people that had signed up.
Yeah, I knew there were former slaves that fought for the Union, but I just didn't realize there was, like, a whole, like, United States Color Troop, like, division.
Right.
Oh.
But it was also interesting because, they also had hayride. Was it a hayride? Yeah, it was a hayride. We didn't go on it because, personally, I've been on them before, and while it is a novel idea, it's not the most comfortable thing in the world. So I was just kind of like, I've had the experience. If you want to go on it, like, we can, but like, I don't personally find it like, it's not. I wouldn't say it's enjoyable, but I wouldn't say it's the worst experience ever. It's just, it's not comfortable on the ride, but like, it is kind of fun in a sense. But they were just going around in like a circle around the area, and I didn't think it was gonna like add anything of value in terms of like, you know what I mean, like.
Yeah,
So I was just like,
That's kind of how I felt too. I was like, I've been on a hayride before. We've already seen the area. What's the point?
Right. If it had been like the first thing we walked in and like it's like a part of a tour or something, I might have thought about it. But like, we had already walked around the grounds and seen what was there and talked to different groups. I didn't really feel the need to go on that. So yeah, that's when we went to get food. I had a barbecue chicken sandwich and Katie had a hot dog.
Yeah, sponsored by the Knights of Columbus.
It was very good. Price was very reasonable. We sat down and we ate. And yeah, then the last thing we did was go into the visitor center to get some souvenirs and some postcards and what have you. And it was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun going there, and it was well worth the trip twice. I would say definitely, like, there was a lot going on at Fairfax History Day, so it was definitely worth checking out and going. I'd highly recommend it. I don't know if we'll go back next year. It really depends, because if it's very similar to what it was this year, as much fun as it was and as enjoyable as it was, we really wouldn't get as much out of it because we've heard these talks before. So it really depends on how much they shake things up. If they talk about different things every year, or if it's the same, then we might go in a few years. But I don't think we'd go next year if it's gonna be the same.
Yeah. Maybe in like 5 or 10 years or something.
Yeah, but yeah, that was a lot of fun. They also gave. The last thing I'll say is the first time we went there, they gave a lot of information about the place and how over time it changed hands and different parts of it started getting sold off. Like, it used to be giant farm, but then they sold off all their moo cows, and well, they sold off all their cows. They sold off all the farm equipment. They sold a huge chunk of the land, and then eventually the last chunk of the land was sold to I believe the county.
Yeah, it was the county.
And that's what we have left as preserved as Blenheim House. I believe the cottage itself was not where it currently is.
Yeah, it was currently or supposed to be at the corner of like, I forget, somewhere in Fairfax.
Yeah.
Then they moved it because otherwise it would have gotten destroyed.
Yeah, and they were like, okay, like, we have the option of keeping it in its historical place, but like not really, because I'm pretty sure that was like sold or something, or like we could move it but like preserve the house at least.
Yeah.
And they were like, of course, like, keeping the house is more important because that's the historical,
significance.
So yeah, that was really cool, and yeah, that's all we got on Blenheim House.
Yeah. We had fun.
What's next on our docket to talk about?
Next time, probably our history adventure down in Central Virginia.
Okay, that sounds good. Until then, it has been fun talking about our memories of Blenheim House and Fairfax History Day.
We know it's been 5 months.
Yeah, well, things get busy.
We got married.
Yeah, things happen. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. That was a really fun time. Both times we went to Blenheim was a lot of fun. They definitely do a good job there. And
I had a lot of fun.
we found out about a lot of other places nearby, and in other areas of Virginia that we should definitely check out when we get the chance.
Yeah.
I know there's at least one house in Manassas they mentioned. There is the Fairfax Museum or something as well.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure how much information they have in there in terms of like whether it'd be worth a visit or not. But they definitely would have information on all the locations around the area, so that might be worthwhile going to just to like get a better idea of where the other places are. But yeah, you can always look up the Civil War Trail, Virginia Civil War Trail, and a lot of these places work together through that to show off Virginian history, and it's very fascinating. So I highly recommend that people either go to Blenheim House, or if you can't do that, then hey, wait till next year and go to Fairfax History Day, because it's awesome and you'll learn a lot. And
it was a lot of fun.
They really put a lot of effort into it.
Yeah, and it was good to see my former coworker Kenneth.
Yeah. That's all we got for this time. Yeah. So next time we have a lot more to discuss and some other items, which will be very exciting. I'm not gonna say too much because I want to keep it,
Yep, we had fun. We had an adventure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was good fun.
Yes, we should go back there.
Yeah, definitely. All right, that's all for this time. Thank you for listening.
Oh, don't forget, we have an email. khsrshow@gmail.com. Jackie, if you're listening, hello.
And goodbye.
And goodbye.